we are pleased to be hosting a diverse panel of speakers. While diverse, they have come together to discuss a very timely and important issue, which is the relationship between Judaism and Zionism. While Judaism is a religion, Zionism is a nationalist political movement that started in the 19th century and still persists today. At first glance, these movements appear to have an interwoven relationship, but our panel will discuss from their personal experiences why it is important to disentangle the two. They are all contributors to Carolyn Karcher's newly edited book that was published earlier this year, titled Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism. Great, yeah, which is also available at the front desk as well. If you haven't bought it already, I highly recommend that you do after the talk. If they haven't convinced you yet, I'm sure they will once you're done listening to them. So on the panel, we have Carolyn Karcher. She is a professor emerita of English, American Studies, and Women's Studies at Temple University, where she received the Great Teacher Award and the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching in 2002. She is a founding member of the DC Metro chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. We also have Emily Siegel over there. She is the program director at Eyewitness Palestine, which organizes educational delegations to Palestine and Israel. She is a trained facilitator, and her research and work has focused on the intersection of justice, peace building, and social change through education. We also have Charlie Wood. He is an activist and lawyer who focuses on issues surrounding freedom of movement for all peoples. In 2009, he spent several months in East Jerusalem and the West Bank assisting local-led efforts to protest the Israeli occupation. Charlie's focus on freedom of movement has led him to the Balkans during the 2015 exodus from Syria, the US-Mexico border, and various other locations around the world. And Chris Godshall? Godshall, thank you. He's a JD candidate at Georgetown University Law Center, specializing in refugee and humanitarian law. In 2014, he co-founded the chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace at Columbia University and Barnard College. So please help me in welcoming them all here tonight. I'll now hand it off to Carolyn. Each will have approximately 10 minutes, give or take, to speak, and then we'll open it up to questions for the audience. So again, thank you all for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Sammy, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Middle East Books and More, for inviting us to speak. This is the first really, I think, more specialized audience that we've had, and so it's both an honor and makes me a little nervous, but that's fine. Interestingly, when you mentioned disentangling Judaism and Zionism, and I just had 2 book events in California, and all of the contributors talked about how the two were absolutely indistinguishable in their upbringings. So disentangling was certainly work that we all had to do. So we're all very grateful to you and grateful to all of you for showing up on this rainy day. I'm going to start by giving an overview of my book, actually our book, and then my contributors and co-panelists will summarize and read extracts from their narratives. I got the idea for the book after hearing a number of people talk about how and why they stopped believing in Israel as a safe haven where Jews could escape persecution, or otherwise put, how and why they stopped believing that the solution to anti-Semitism was for Jews to have a state of their own which they could control and which would privilege them over non-Jews. I decided to collect these stories with the aim of producing a book people could use as a vehicle for starting difficult conversations within Jewish families and communities and between Jews and non-Jews troubled by Israeli policies but nervous about criticizing them, especially with all of the attempts to equate criticizing Israel with anti-Semitism. I chose the format of stories because I knew from experience that when people tell their own stories honestly and sincerely, they can open the hearts and minds of others, especially when others can identify with aspects of those stories. I began with a few acquaintances who I knew had really interesting stories to tell. Emily Siegel was one of the first people I thought of, and you'll see why I thought her story was so interesting and so much worth including in this anthology. Moving beyond acquaintances, I solicited narratives from people who told personal stories at public events or wrote insightful op-eds, articles, or letters to the editor. And I found more contributors when those I recruited spread the word through their networks. To ensure that the collection reflected diverse backgrounds and perspectives, which you won't see on today's panel, but which are in the book, I made special efforts to seek out Sephardi Mizrahi as well as Ashkenazi Jewish contributors. And for those of you unfamiliar with those terms, Sephardi Mizrahi refers very, very roughly to Jews from the Mediterranean and Muslim worlds, and Ashkenazi very, very roughly to European Jews. And if I went into more detail, it would take all evening. In view of the leading role that college-age Jews are playing in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I worked hard to enlist them too, and I was delighted to get Chris among others. I ended up with 40 fresh and deeply personal accounts. The contributors to this book are rabbis, professors of Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies, other academics, journalists and media specialists, lawyers, health professionals, social workers, activists, and recent graduates. They range in age from people in their 70s, like me, to those in their 20s, like Chris. I divided the book into 5 chapters: Rabbinic Voices, Transformational Experiences in Israel-Palestine, Voices from the Campuses, Progressive Values versus Zionism, and Reflections of Leading Organizers. In addition to collecting and editing the narratives, I wrote an introduction and afterword to put them into a broader context. The introduction provides a brief history of Zionism and Anti-Zionism from 1880 to 1948, and the afterword traces American Jews' changing attitudes toward Israel from 1948 to 2018, when I had to turn in the manuscript, so I couldn't go beyond that. So I'll now read extracts from the introduction and the afterword. Most people don't know that American Jewish leaders began speaking out against Zionist aims and ideology very early, soon after Britain issued the 1917 Balfour Declaration, promising to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In March 1919, on the eve of the post-World War I Paris Peace Conference, Julius Kahn, the German-born Jewish congressman from San Francisco, delivered to President Wilson a statement to the peace conference endorsed by 299 Jews. The document denounced the Zionists for attempting to segregate Jews and to reverse the historical trend toward emancipation. Its signers objected to the creation of a distinctly Jewish state in Palestine, not only because they feared it would jeopardize the status of Jews like themselves in their home countries, but because they found it, quote, contrary to the principles of democracy, end quote, to elevate Jewish immigrants over Palestine's Muslim and Christian native inhabitants. They explicitly denied the existence of ethnic ties among Jews and asserted their wish not to see Palestine, quote, either now or at any time in the future become a Jewish state, end quote. They petitioned instead for Palestine to be made into an independent, free, and democratic state that would not recognize any distinctions of creed, race, or ethnic descent among its citizens. American Jews' public agitation against Zionism continued when, in 1922, the U.S. Congress debated the American equivalent of the Balfour Declaration, the Lodge-Fish Resolution, which eventually passed. Testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Rabbi David Phillipson emphasized that, quote, Zionists do not speak for all Jews, end quote. He particularly rejected the characterization of Palestine as the national home of the Jewish people. Quote, no land can be spoken of as the national home of the Jewish people, he countered, as Jews are nationals of many lands. end quote. Philipson articulated the philosophy of Reform Judaism, which had repudiated the religious premises of Zionism decades before the birth of the Zionist movement. Contrasting Reform Judaism with Zionism, Philipson wrote, quote, Reform Judaism is spiritual. Zionism is political. Reform Judaism is universal. Zionism is particularistic. Reform Judaism looks to the future. Zionism to the past, end quote. The future to which Reform Jews looked was one in which they could assimilate fully into American life on the same footing as Christians, while retaining their Jewish faith. And the past they feared that Zionism would revive was one of ghettoization, discrimination, and treatment as aliens. So I'll now read the last 3 paragraphs of the afterword before turning it over to my co-panelists. The narratives presented in this book defy stereotypes of both a monolithic pro-Israel Jewish community and a ragtag band of self-hating Jews outside it. On the contrary, they reveal that many who now reject Zionism do so out of deeply held religious values and remain observant Jews, while others take pride in a secular Jewish identity intertwined with their progressive ideals. As diverse as they are, these narratives share some common threads, pointing to 5 main reasons why their authors have ceased to identify themselves as Zionists. First, those who have witnessed the Israeli occupation firsthand have learned that a state run by Jews, for Jews, and dependent on maintaining a Jewish majority cannot guarantee either physical safety or spiritual wholeness for Jews. Indeed, that such a state must necessarily be an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. Second, those who have formed warm relationships with Palestinians, whether as college classmates, partners in coalitions for justice, or hosts during trips to the region, have overcome a major obstacle to envisioning a future in which Jews and Palestinians can live harmoniously together as equals. Third, those who have attended Jewish day school, Hebrew school, and Zionist summer camp, especially when they have taken seriously the commitment to social justice fostered by their Jewish education, have sooner or later recognized the contradiction between that commitment and Israel's cruel treatment of Palestinians. Once they applied to Israel the critical thinking they had been taught to consider the essence of Judaism, they came up against the censorship and silencing necessary to preserve faith in Israel as a democratic haven for the Jews and in Zionism as a central tenet of Judaism. Fourth, as the cases of, and I'm referring to people in the book, Professors Ella Shohat, Shoshana Madmoni Gerber, Sami Shalom Shetrit, and Clarice Harbon indicate, the blatant discrimination that Sephardi Mizrahi Jews have confronted has exposed the falsity of Zionism's promises. In Madmoni Gerber's words, quote, the Zionist relation to Mizrahim carries a history of oppression and deceit, making the inclusion of Mizrahim possible only on the condition that they remain subordinate to Ashkenazi power and hate their identities and their cultures, end quote. Fifth, secular Jewish progressives have typically begun to question Zionism when they've discovered that the racial equality and religious tolerance they uphold in the U.S. are not practiced in Israel, and that Israel has joined the U.S. in supporting the reactionary regimes against which progressives have fought in Vietnam, South Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. For many, rejecting Zionism has entailed alienating family members, losing friends, and enduring expulsion from Jewish communal spaces. In compensation, however, dissenting Jews have found new spiritual homes in Open Hillel, If Not Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, and non-Zionist Havarot and Minyans, informal prayer groups, that have been springing up around the country. These alternative spiritual communities have been infusing new meaning into ancient Jewish rituals of Kaddish, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover, among others. Liberated from the need to defend the morally indefensible in the name of keeping the Jews safe, a safety that has proved dubious at best, dissenters can now ask forgiveness during Yom Kippur for the crimes committed against Palestinians, and prospectively celebrate freedom during Passover for all the victims of Zionism, Palestinians, Mizrahi Jews, and even the Israeli settlers and soldiers whose souls have become so twisted by fighting for dominance. Above all, the rediscovery of a Jewish diasporic tradition of what Rabbi Brant Rosen calls worldwide spiritual peoplehood can provide a foundation for solidarity with the oppressed everywhere that can make Jews better partners with others in the struggle for universal freedom, justice, and equality. So let me now turn the floor over to Emily.
Sure. You have to scoot up so I can see you all a little bit more. All right. So I'm going to read portions of my chapter, but also talk a little bit in between to kind of contextualize it, since reading the whole thing would take quite a long time. I work to encourage, facilitate, and support travel to Palestine, Israel by individuals in the U.S. These trips take visitors to the holy and religious sites, yes, but also help them dig deeper, learn more about the realities on the ground, truly understand the ways in which the systems of oppression by the Israeli government have affected this holy land, and most important, learn about the creative and resilient ways Palestinians are working to change the status quo. I've served as program director for Eyewitness Palestine, formerly known as Interfaith Peacebuilders, for 9 years. And I find myself every day feeling lucky to be doing something I care so passionately about, and knowing that the work I am doing affects so many. Still, when I was denied entry by the Israeli Border Authority for this exact work in April 2018, I was surprised, and so were many around me. How is it that I went from the year leading up to my 21st birthday, enjoying life within Israeli society, studying and partying at Ben Gurion University, and then spent my 35th birthday held for hours in a detention center at Ben Gurion Airport before being flown back to the US? How did I go from the lowest security threat, welcomed warmly upon arrival at the airport, and walked around baggage scans by the airport security upon exit because such inspection simply wasn't needed for me, to being labeled a public safety security threat and banned for at least 5 years? Is my transformation that threatening? Is wanting peace with justice so scary? It really wasn't easy for me to write this narrative. It took me months. Months went by and I never really could find the right words or sort of take time from what I saw as my real work to really think about how I got to this point. And it really wasn't until my denial of entry, about a year and a half ago now, that I was able to write it. First, I had time. I had 3 weeks that I was supposed to be in Palestine, so I didn't have any organizing meetings on my calendar or other responsibilities that I was supposed to be doing. But also, I think thinking about the questions that I was asked during interrogation really made me think about what are the things that I've done that they were asking me about that really is that threatening about me coming there. And one of the main things that the Israeli security went through in my interrogations were the different times that I had been there, because I think in a 15-year period I'd been there probably 20 times. So they went through and started at the beginning, and I think they were a little bit surprised about what they heard. So I think what I'll do is kind of go through a couple of those times to talk about what I was doing, but also what are the things that I learned along the way. A little background about me. I grew up in a relatively typical secular Jewish American family. For part of my childhood, I lived down the street in Mount Pleasant, so I'm from DC. And in a lot of ways, I found my connection to Judaism through my connection to Israel, and as my connection to Israel grew. When I was 16, I went on a teen tour with the Jewish Community Center of DC, and we spent 6 weeks traveling around, seeing historical sites that were important to Judaism, hiking and seeing the beauty of Israel and connecting with Israel and how important it was to us as a Jewish community. During the trip, we never really talked about anything happening, and this was in 2000, so there was definitely things happening around us that we were not talking about. And the last night of the trip, we ended up at a restaurant where there was a protest happening because Ehud Barak had just returned from Camp David and was about to address this peace rally. They allowed us to stay, and it was definitely a moving experience for me. And so I'll read just a short reflection from that night. That night, my last night in Israel, I returned to the hotel and wrote in my journal, which I still have today, that my life had changed at that peace rally. I had to find a way to be involved in this struggle for peace, and I couldn't see myself going forward without being a part of it. That trip left me with a profound sense of connection to Israel and a desire to help bring about the peace that people were calling for at that rally. I did go to undergrad to study international relations and thought that I had in my head what peace meant. And I studied Jewish studies, sociology as well, and part of my studies led me to spend 8 months at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, or the Negev. And there I lived with Israelis and traveled all around with them, meeting their families. I took intense courses on Israeli society from an Israeli perspective, but I also ended up volunteering at a Bedouin school, which really had a big effect on me and opened my eyes. So I'll read a little bit about that experience. The teacher I was assisting pulled up in a blue pickup truck, her husband behind the wheel, and drove a short distance before stopping at the side of the road on the edge of what looked like an endless desert. This was as far as we could drive to reach the school where I would be tutoring. We then walked for 10 minutes to a small building where I would meet about 20 10-year-old students eager to sing Beyoncé and learn new songs from me. I would take this journey once a week for about 2 months. It was only a short ride away, but it felt worlds away from the university atmosphere and the Israeli friends I was building relationships with there. Those rides allowed me to form a friendship with the teacher I was assisting. I learned about her life in Jordan and how her parents had ended up there in 1948 after being forced to flee their villages in Israel. How she grew up in Amman, isolated from the rest of her tribe, and returned to Israel because she had to marry within that tribe, and knew very few members of it who also lived in Jordan. Moving back to this society from a big city like Amman was hard on her, and very difficult from the independent life she had growing up. She explained what it felt like to live in an unrecognized village, in a place she called home but which had been robbed of everything that really felt like home. Learning from her and visiting her village prompted me to begin asking questions about the lack of electricity, plumbing, and medical services in the area so close to where I was living in comfort. When my time studying abroad ended, I was determined to learn more, but had few ideas about how to do so or where to go with my questions. I returned from those 8 months and really re-immersed myself in university life, but also missed my time in Israel. And it actually led me to seek out at my university a place that I felt comfortable in, which ended up being the pro-Israel group at my college. There was no SJP at the time or any presence of anything else other than that on my campus. And while I did that, I also still had kind of an interest in peace and thinking that I could be pro-Israel and pro-peace. And at that time, basically, it led me back there after I graduated because I wanted to go and create the peace that was in my head at the time. And I ended up interning that year at an organization that brings Palestinian and Israeli children to the US for camp. And my role was to interview Palestinian youth who wanted to come to the camp basically to test their English skills. And so I was told by my boss who was the first person to take me into the West Bank, that I was allowed to ask them anything I wanted. So this is what I did. I decided to ask each of them the same question. If you could tell an Israeli anything about your life, what would it be? What I heard that day, the first day, and in many interviews to come, was heartbreaking and something I could not ignore. I was told about the checkpoints many of them had to go through to get to school, about life in refugee camps, about the Nakba and what their grandparents had experienced, about their fathers who were currently in prison. I was told about their wishes for peace, to be able to travel to Jerusalem to pray, or just to play with friends they could no longer see. The stories went on, and as each child spoke to me, I kept asking myself how I could have gone so long without knowing any of this. I knew these weren't made-up stories because a 12-year-old has no inclination to be disingenuous, and none of them were aware of how little I really knew about what they were telling me. By the end of that first day, after returning to Jerusalem through my first checkpoint, I had a very different understanding of what I was seeing around me. It was as if something had been missing from my education all my life. Why had I never been exposed to the realities I had just witnessed? Was my community, my university, trying to keep this from me? I was very lucky at the time to return from that trip to both an amazing internship and a master's program at American University, where I had an incredibly supportive community and a really wonderful political education with an advisor who was Palestinian himself, and really amazing peers who helped encourage me to ask and seek out answers for all of my questions. But it also, in a lot of ways, gave me sort of the political views that I was starting to form. It gave me sort of the information and the academic background to be able to back those up. So I'm gonna sort of end where I began, with how writing this narrative allowed me to kind of look back at why Israel is threatened by me now, and where I am today. Now that I can look back at this part of my life, I see that this transformation was, in some ways, natural for me. What I was seeing and learning related to so many things that were happening all around me all my life. My parents and grandparents had been involved in politics, desegregation, and labor work. I'd grown up within diverse communities and had learned about inequality. How could I not understand quickly and want to learn more when confronted with similar issues taking place somewhere else? Moving away from the people I had become close to through the Jewish community was hard. To this day, I still have to confront questions and arguments from long-term friends I met during those programs. How can you think the way you do? You lived there, you know the truth, they say. My answer is always the same. I found the right pair of glasses, which allowed me to see the reality, not just the truth that my community I had surrounded myself with wanted me to see. I found a new community, one that resembled the one I grew up in, diverse, compassionate, lively, and incredibly powerful. If this means that Israel now sees me as a threat and doesn't want me to visit, I'm fine with that. In many ways, I understand why I would be threatening to the Israeli government. I have a background that would seem to lead to conclusions about Israel's right to exist as it is today, yet my path led me to believe that something very different is possible, is necessary. What the exact solution is not for me to define, but I will continue to be vocal about insisting that the world push to bring something different about. I still believe in and fight for peace, just as I did as a teenager at the end of that teen tour. However, today I understand that peace cannot come without justice, and that it must bring freedom, justice, and equality for us all, not just some. I'm also proud to proclaim that I am anti-Zionist. As such, I believe that solidarity is the true path to safety and liberation for everyone, and that it offers the only way for us to fight against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of white supremacy. I still have a lot to learn, and through my work and friends, find myself doing so every day. I confront my privilege as a white Jewish American from a middle-class background almost daily. I try to expand the ways in which I connect the things I grew up around in the US to what I understand about Palestine and vice versa. I continue to read and expand my understanding of oppressive systems and how they affect the world we live in. I learn lessons of resistance and persistent struggle from Palestinians, both in Palestine and the US, every single day. Most importantly, I continue to immerse myself in communities that uphold the same values of justice that I hold. Communities I continue to learn from and that I hope may sometimes learn something from me. I am grateful for the path I've been on and where I've ended up. It's created a world around me, while filled with frustrations and sadness, is even more filled with love and kindness, strength and powerful voices, and most of all, beauty in so many forms. Thank you.
I'm thinking you should go before Charlie.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I've got to find my page. Okay. I joked at the last event that I was really late with my narrative to Carolyn, and I didn't. Yeah.
Poor Carolyn.
I had to nag a lot.
Yeah, there was. Yeah. I thought you hated me at first. I was so late. But I realized that I think I just saved it on my computer as my journey from Zionism to Anti-Zionism, like intending to change the title later. But then when I sent it off, I just kept it the sort of default title. And so my title is just so bland, and it, in hindsight, if I could go back, I would have named it My Life as a Jew Named Christopher, because a lot of my narrative is intertwined with the fact that my mother is Jewish and my father is Christian, and that's a very sort of unique perspective, I think, to sort of come at this issue, and it informed a lot of my experiences in Israel and Palestine, and sort of my journey from Zionism to Anti-Zionism. So I'll read a little bit. Basically, the beginning is talking about how as I grew into a teenager and a young adult, I wanted to explore my Jewish heritage a little bit more, and naturally, like, you're just funneled into Birthright when you want to do that. So I ended up in Birthright. And for those of you who don't, I'm sure you all know what Birthright is. Yeah. If you don't, it's a program that basically any Jewish person below the age of, in their mid-20s or below, can go for free to a 10-day trip to Israel. And they take you all around, and it's very, it's a propaganda tool, basically. So I'll start there with my trip in Israel. Shortly before my 19th birthday in June 2011, I left for Israel with a group of 20 or so complete strangers. Israel, or at least the part Birthright shows you, is beautiful. We visited Caesarea, Tiberias, Tel Aviv, and of course, Jerusalem. I spent my birthday in a Tel Aviv bar and prayed at the Western Wall in the Old City. I toured Yad Vashem and climbed Masada for an improvised bar mitzvah at the top to make up for the one that I'd never had. It was a great time, but not even the rosy picture painted by Birthright can totally obscure the not-so-picturesque reality of Israel. Two small things stick in my memory as having triggered a sort of, that doesn't really match what they're telling me moment. The first occurred on the border of Israel and Lebanon at a kibbutz we visited. A resident of the kibbutz, an older American man who had moved to Israel a few decades before, spoke to all of us in a room overlooking southern Lebanon. I don't remember everything I saw and heard, but two things stand out. First, his shirt. It was disturbing to say the least. It listed all of the failed genocides of the Jewish people and their dates. It started with the attempt by Haman in the story of Esther, and ended with Iran, ? If his choice of apparel didn't hint at the sort of attitude he had, his talk made it very clear. The second thing I remember is something he said in his talk about how he would do anything to defend Israel and the Jewish people. To paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, "Even the women and children of Lebanon are guilty of crimes against Israel, and I would shoot anyone who came at the border, even a child." I and a few other participants were justifiably appalled. When we left, the tour guide explained it away as a fringe attitude in Israel born of fear and conflict. The second thing I remember as having made me question the narrative of Birthright was the site of East Jerusalem. In hindsight, it's clear to me how much is hidden from Birthright participants, nothing more so than evidence of the occupation of Palestine. I saw East Jerusalem while climbing a very steep hill as we walked back from the City of David Archaeological Park. Unlike the western part of the city, East Jerusalem is visibly impoverished and underdeveloped. I knew, of course, about Palestine and the occupation, and even questioned its legitimacy in conversations on the subject, but like many others, I accepted it all the same. To see it in person, however, drove those questions to the forefront of my mind, and eventually forced me to see Israel in a different light. I came home from my 10-day trip with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I, for lack of a better term, felt Jewish for the first time in my life. I went to Israel and was told over and over that I had a place there and in the larger Jewish community. On the other hand, I wasn't sure that the arguments and justifications for the more questionable things I saw were sufficient. It took a little while, but after my birthright trip, it sort of very rapidly, as the rest of my narrative shows, I ended up sort of really involved in anti-Zionist activity. I don't mention this in my narrative, but fun fact, I was once interviewed actually about this experience, and the CEO of Birthright called me a failure of the program.
Yeah,
I was like, great, this is awesome. Put it on my resume. So, as I just said, this stage in my journey through Zionism didn't last very long. The novelty of belonging wore off quickly, and the questions I had been ignoring bubbled to the surface. I began to read up on Israel and Palestine and learned more about the occupation. A dissonance began to form between the Zionist narrative I was hearing, that Israel was a victim defending itself from hostile neighbors to protect the Jewish people, and my growing understanding that Israel was, in fact, an aggressor illegally occupying and colonizing Palestinian land. When I expressed these thoughts to people from my birthright trip, I was met with, at best, disregard and at worst, hostility. I hadn't yet abandoned Zionism itself. I didn't necessarily have a problem with the Jewish state, just the occupation and the prevention of the creation of a Palestinian state. But I certainly wasn't on the same page as Aish, which is the provider of the trip that I went to, a very far-right organization I didn't know at the time, or the people on my birthright trip. I found myself yet again searching for a place in the Jewish community, but this time with some ideological prerequisites. At the end of my second year, I thought I had found just such a place, the new chapter of J Street U at Columbia and Barnard. I remember seeing a sign on campus and reaching out to the chapter's organizer to set up a chat. Next thing I knew, I was at my first meeting. J Street seemed perfect to me. It was critical of the occupation of Palestine and was devoting its energy to bringing awareness to the two-state solution in a movement they called the Two Campaign. The first event on this campaign focused on obstacles to the two-state solution, such as the division of Jerusalem and refugees. This event marked the beginning of the end of my involvement with J Street, and probably the moment I realized I didn't only take issue with the occupation, but with Zionism itself. It became clear to me in the course of the discussion on Jerusalem that it is not possible to split the city equitably. When we turned to the topic of Palestinian refugees, it became clear to me that a return only to the Palestinian territories was not feasible, given the limited resources and archipelago-like split of the land. I said as much, but was met with confusion because obviously the Palestinians could not live in Israel in large numbers, lest the Jewish majority be eroded. With this, the fundamental question presented itself. Why should I, an American Jew, only theoretically descended from a member of some ancient civilization, have more of a birthright to this land than a Palestinian, indisputably descended from someone who had lived there less than a century ago? The answer was clear. I shouldn't. I woke up to the fact that the state of Israel is built on an artificial Jewish majority maintained by the continued dispossession of the Palestinians, and that it uses my, quote, protection to justify this dispossession. I couldn't continue working with J Street after this realization. I still wanted to belong to a Jewish community, though, but none existed that tolerated anti-Zionism. Furthermore, I felt that I had an obligation as an anti-Zionist Jew to make my voice heard. Luckily, I wasn't the only student in this position. At this point, my understanding of Zionism and Israel-Palestine was sufficient to begin forming an opinion, but I would need more knowledge to justify it effectively to unfriendly audiences. I decided to add a concentration in Middle Eastern studies to my coursework, and took classes on Zionism, the politics of Israel-Palestine, and the history of the Middle East. Everything I learned about the region and history of the conflict further solidified my understanding that Zionism is, at its core, a colonialist project designed to maintain Jewish privilege at the expense of the Palestinian people. At the same time, the more I learned about Zionism and the experience of Jews in the 19th and 20th centuries, the more I understood why so many Jews, and non-Jews for that matter, accept Zionism so uncritically. It makes sense, after the horrors Jews have survived, that people would cling to an ideology that purports to be the only thing capable of preventing a reoccurrence of the Holocaust. This seems to be where most people's understanding of Zionism comes to an end. It's a compelling enough reason for a majority Jewish state that people don't really ask the logistical, legal, and moral questions that follow. Taken together with Zionism's success, painting its critics as ignorant or even anti-Semitic, it's no wonder the justification for Israel's existence based on the Holocaust has enjoyed virtually unquestioned acceptance. This takes me about to my junior year in college, and I describe in this section how I sort of set up for myself an anti-birthright. I didn't know about programs like Eyewitness Palestine, because I was living in Jordan over the summer, and so my friends and I in 2014 crossed the Jordanian-Israeli border, which I don't recommend. And it was during it was during Operation Protective Edge. It was a whole thing. But I kind of I did the opposite of what Birthright shows you. I went only to places in the West Bank. I looked at all the places that I had read about in my studies, and made sure that I kind of saw firsthand the things that I knew I hadn't seen the first time. When I returned is when there was really a fire under my ass, for lack of a better word. I got back and I was connected to another student from who was actually a member of J Street U at Columbia. The person who introduced me in the first place. She eventually left J Street for the same reasons I did. We set up a meeting and we instantly hit it off. To this day, she's one of my best friends, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for all she's done for me. After that initial meeting, we didn't waste any time. We reached out to the national leadership of Jewish Voice for Peace and immediately began laying the groundwork for our own campus chapter. JVP was everything I had been hoping for, a community of Jews critical of Israel and the occupation and working towards justice for Palestine. Moreover, it was changing the narrative of the American Jewish community's relationship with the State of Israel and with Zionism. We were excited to bring this to Columbia's campus, where no such organization existed. We eventually got the organization set up. We originally tried to get recognized by the Hillel on campus, not successfully. In hindsight, I'm glad we didn't, because I think that would have put like a cap on a lot of the work we were trying to do. And it sort of came to a head in Columbia every year has a Students for Justice of Palestine, a bunch of campuses, but at Columbia it's a particularly divisive event. They put on Israeli Apartheid Week. So what we did was decided to talk to SJP and help them out with Apartheid Week. Israeli Apartheid Week usually happened like this. SJP would set up its mock wall on College Walk, which is a main walk through the middle of campus, and the campus's most right-wing Zionist group, which was a group called ARIA at the time, which is now called Students Supporting Israel. They've gone farther and farther to the right since I've left. They counter-protest right across the way. But that wasn't the case for my senior year in 2015. So basically what we did was, instead of the Zionist group, because we knew when SJP was going to do the week, they always kept it a secret to try to prevent the counter-protest, we kind of booked the across the way table out from under the Zionist group. And our signage, it screamed Jewish Voice for Peace, and it was this whole thing, and a bunch of, passersby stopped from, Columbia's right in the middle of the city too, so you got people just from off the streets too. And they saw, Jewish, and they were like, oh, Zionism, okay. And they came and they expected to hear those arguments, but instead they heard about how we as Jews stood with the Palestinian students across the road, not against them. We heard a range of reactions, everything from anger to curiosity to thankfulness. That last reaction was the most meaningful to me. We were actually thanked by other Jews for having the courage to say what they privately felt. After Apartheid Week, our membership grew quite a bit. My friend and I had succeeded in building the Jewish community we had been looking for. We've both since left Columbia, but our chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace continues to thrive, providing a community for Jewish students fighting for justice in Palestine. And they've in fact combined with SJP, and they have now, it's called Apartheid Divest, and it's a divestment campaign on Columbia's campus. Not successful yet, but they're getting a lot of support. And I'll end with just sort of my reflections on sort of the end of my journey. My path has touched on every stratum of the Zionist spectrum. I started off enamored with Israel and the belonging my birthright trip provided me. I made a pit stop in liberal Zionism, against the occupation but okay with the maintenance of Jewish privilege in Israel. Finally, I left Zionism altogether. Let me be clear. I'm not non-Zionist, I'm anti-Zionist. I cannot accept an ideology that calls for the perpetual dispossession of the Palestinian people so that I or any other Jewish person can enjoy unfettered access to privileges and resources in a state built on stolen land. The privileging of Jews over Palestinians in Israel-Palestine is not a mistake of Zionism, it is its goal. I can participate in this no more than I can in any other ideology that renders one group superior to another. Indeed, I have a responsibility as a member of the privileged group to dismantle the very idea that I should be prioritized. It is not enough for me to say that I'm not a Zionist. I have to be absolutely opposed to the doctrine. This responsibility has become so wrapped up in my Jewish identity that there really isn't a distinction anymore. I can't ignore Zionism. It's too embedded in modern Jewish identity. I obviously won't accept it, and I certainly won't give up the Jewish identity I've worked so hard to cultivate. Thus, if I am to continue to participate in Judaism, I must oppose Zionism. Anything less and I'd be a hypocrite, complicit in the injustice I've described. I'm lucky to have had people guide me toward this conclusion. It is a frightening thing to stand against a dominant trend in your community. Perhaps more so when presumptions questioning your membership already exist. Introducing yourself as Christopher does raise some eyebrows from time to time. Without the bravery of other dissenting Jews, I probably wouldn't have found a home in the Jewish community. I would have missed out on the richness of half my heritage and the opportunity to fight for something important. I hope that other young Jews are so fortunate. I hope that my path can help guide others finding their own way, and that in the end we will have played some small role in reorienting our community towards justice.
Hard acts to follow. I'll do my best, and I'll start with an admission to Carolyn, actually, that I had not read the entirety of the book until pretty recently, and I will tell everyone that very highly recommend you to purchase the book, and it's a heavy book, it's heavy reading, but to read a couple of them, a couple stories, one or two, and some you'll find will maybe resonate with you deeply, and some you'll find don't, and I think that's the quality of a book like this. One of the great qualities of a book like this is that there are so many diverse perspectives in here that there's something for everybody, and I think it's something that maybe will teach you a new way to think about your own feelings about the situation, which is really valuable, at least in my view. So to frame my story a little bit, I also was someone who was raised Jewish, and I was raised in a Reform Jewish community in the Chicago area, and very service-oriented. So as Carolyn was mentioning, the different strains of contributors to the book, I kind of fall in that Judaism and service were like deeply and are deeply intertwined in kind of in my values. So I kind of always in the back of my head had a question of what my relationship to Israel and Palestine and the conflict was, and I knew that I needed to go and see myself. So I also took Christopher's path and did a birthright trip. So I think if the CEO Birthright did know about me, I would probably also be classified as a distinct failure as well. But I went in January of 2009, so a pretty sad and important time, at the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, and kind of some like beginning of some I classified as like kind of a third intifada, and like the recent kind of aggressions against Palestine, or more overt aggressions at least. And what I'm going to read today is a short passage about an experience that I had on the Birthright trip that made me kind of more deeply realize that I needed to go and see with my own eyes what was happening in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and other parts of Palestine. And then I'll follow that with kind of a more visceral account of an experience that I had during with a family in East Jerusalem that was dispossessed from their house while I was in the house. I apologize. Talking a little bit about like writing down the story, it's rereading it. Sometimes I can get a little bit emotional still, even rereading it now. So like, I'll apologize in advance that if I have to stop a couple times during that part. So So, while we were in Israel, the 2009 war was underway in the Gaza Strip. Even the word war, I wrote this originally as kind of a cathartic piece, and using the word war in language is so important. It's not really a war when somebody is just bombing another person, a group of people. Although I do not remember exactly how the discussion came about, I do remember that I mentioned, and this is the discussion during the birthright trip, that I mentioned the difference in resources that the Gazans had in comparison to Israelis. In response, the group organizers showed the group a cover picture from the Israeli daily Haaretz that included a photo of Gaza City from 2 kilometers away. And to them, this was like a demonstration that, like, look at, they have cities, they have buildings, they have resources. And it seemed that was about as close to reality as we were going to be getting in any discussion about what was happening in Gaza. Later in the discussion, one of the Americans on the trip compared the plight of the citizens of Gaza to that of Americans in Appalachia. I was appalled and felt isolated, so I stormed out. How could these seemingly educated and compassionate people fail to see that there were no bombs falling in Appalachia, and that the social, economic, political, psychological, emotional, and cultural impact of decades of meddling and isolation had produced a ghetto with over 1.5 million residents? Looking back, I see that I was also feeling embarrassingly underinformed. Despite having taken an entire college course on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the biggest idea that struck me from that course is that both sides have had conflicting narratives of the past and present, as well as visions for the future. I felt as if I had cultivated each of these narratives and they were fighting inside of me. No matter how ignorant I may have been at the time, I still could feel that I needed to look for myself. So that was kind of how I came out of my birthright trip, and I knew that I needed to go and see more. So it took me some time. I went down into the Sinai for a while and kind of collected my thoughts. Came up through Jordan, over the bridge. I don't know if you went just like wandered over the border. That sounds a lot worse.
Pretty spur of the moment.
And progressively kind of got more and more involved in Palestinian-led resistance to the occupation in the West Bank. That eventually led me to working with the organizers in Belin and Nailin, and that led me to protecting a home during a night raid, arresting a 12-year-old boy that supposedly was involved in rock throwing at a protest of the wall, and that led to me being pretty badly beaten and arrested and ended up in Israeli jail for about a month. Came out of that and surprisingly they said I couldn't go to the West Bank, but when I actually asked the military judge if they included East Jerusalem, and they said they don't recognize East Jerusalem, it only is Jerusalem. So I got to go back to East Jerusalem and continue my activism, and that's where this next story comes from. It's the Haneun family, who were one of the families that was dispossessed of their home. They moved there, or were moved there about 60 years ago when lots of Arabs were expelled from West Jerusalem. So I'll start my story from there. So the Haneuns were one of 28 families who were given homes in East Jerusalem by the UN and Jordanian government after they became refugees as a result of Israel's War of Independence, called the Nakba, or catastrophe, by Palestinians. Between 650 and 750,000 Palestinians were driven out or fled in terror as Israelis displayed their newfound power, massacring villages such as Al-Sheikh, Deir Yassin, and Damash. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied East Jerusalem and claimed large sections of land based upon Ottoman-era land documents. Settler organizations made several unsuccessful attempts in court to evict the Haneun family. In 1982, at a time when Palestinian lawyers were boycotting Israeli courts, the Haneun's Israeli lawyer agreed without his client's consent to recognize the settlers' ownership of the land if the Haneuns were given protected tenant rights. The family didn't know or accept the agreement and continued to reject it. Furthermore, A translation of the settlers' documents revealed that they claimed an unspecified tract of land in the area of the Haneun's house and had only made a 3-year rental agreement. So this, just to stop, like, this is a common occurrence in East Jerusalem where settlers will find a maybe 150-year-old document that said the Jews lived in this tract of land potentially at some point, and then use that as to make a claim that they have a right to reclaim that land from the people that lived there for generations. So I'll jump now to, this is kind of the hard part of the story, but as in a bad dream, I awoke before dawn to screams and breaking glass. Soon, tear gas canisters were flying over the wall, and I realized that the forced eviction was underway. Being the only international at the house, and the first to awaken, I had the agonizing responsibility of waking Salim and the others. Since then, I have had a recurring dream where I wake up on that couch to the eviction and begin walking into the house to Salim's room. In the dream, time slows to a snail's pace, though my mind races along and the 10-meter walk takes hours. I still feel overcome with shame when I think of that morning. After waking up Salim, I had an immense urge to urinate, and fear was racing through my veins. I was afraid for myself. I was afraid of being deported to the US, of going back to prison, of not being able to continue traveling, or being active in the movements that I was involved with. It hurts to admit this, but it's the truth. I woke Salim and felt at a complete loss for words. They're here was all that I could manage. He quickly rose, and we had a moment where I felt such tremendous sadness and helplessness. The weight of injustice was overwhelming, and I couldn't hold his gaze. Soon the Special Forces police stormed through the back gate and grabbed us, dragging us outside. And I will admit, I was arrested while pissing, not while non-violently resisting. Outside, we saw the other families and activists strewn across the barely lit street. Hundreds of police were swarming through with huge guns, and the streets was closed off. All of this to arrest mostly women and children. I was isolated with several guards. 16-year-old Jana Haneun, Salim's niece, spotted me. Knowing I had recently been released from jail, she yelled to me, "Please, can I just give him a hug to say goodbye?" Tears of pain and anger streaming down her face. Even then, she was thinking of me. My selfish thoughts a few minutes prior burned deeper. Soldiers grabbed her, dragging her away, breaking her front tooth, and denying us our goodbye and what we both thought might be the last time we would see each other. I was told to follow an officer and put with several other internationals into the back of a police van. As soon as I was in the van, I began to involuntarily shake. The combination of emotions in me was completely overwhelming. As we sat in the cage in the back of the van, an appalling scene unfurled. The blocked off street was opened momentarily for a massive moving truck. The van stopped in front of the houses, and several people came out exchanging handshakes and hugs with the police officers. They entered the houses through broken down doors, the tear gas just dissipating. Soon it became clear that they were moving the personal items of the families into their van. Later I learned they were settlers. After removing all the family's belongings, they drove to an abandoned field a few miles away and dumped them, simultaneously moving into the houses themselves. The Haneuns were without a home and began living on the street about 50 meters from the house where they had lived for the past 60 years. So I guess that
That's a
kind of
hard act
speaks
to
for
follow,
itself.
too.
Yeah.
Thank you.